Good evening, everyone. Welcome and welcome back to Arts and Letters Live at the Dallas Museum of Art. We're thrilled that you've gathered here with us to celebrate our first in-person event since February of 2020. And it's beautifully fitting that Richard Blanco will be welcoming us home, in a sense, back to the museum and into public events. To everyone, your presence is truly a gift. I also briefly want to acknowledge that we've all been through some things in the past year, to put it mildly. And I know that being here tonight, especially in person, took effort by all of you, and it may have taken getting through a little anxiety or awkwardness and getting back out into public and driving and parking and gathering in this auditorium. And since we're all getting back into the swing of things, there may be some folks here who are in a big public space for the first time. So if you indulge me for a moment, I just want you to wave or say hello to someone sitting a distance from you, in front or behind you, just to let them know you're glad they're there. Thank you. So I feel like it's worth, warming ourselves back up into gathering and interacting. And if you'll also give a warm, silent wave to the viewers streaming at home right now, live, to acknowledge their presence. One last thing before I turn it over to our distinguished community member who will introduce Richard Blanco. There are two housekeeping things I just want to mention. We will have 2 staff members with microphones during the question and answer period towards the end of this talk. So if you have a question at that point, please raise your hand high and either Carolyn or Jen will come to you with a microphone and offer to hold it out to you to speak into. Or if you don't feel comfortable for social distancing reasons with the mic, you can just say your question and they will speak it into the mic to Mr. Blanco. It's up to you. And viewers at home can type into the chat and Michelle in the back will read their questions out loud. So we're all sort of gathering hybrid here. Second housekeeping piece is there will be a book signing after the talk in the concourse in front of the museum store that you passed by on the way in. Just take a left when you leave the auditorium. And Richard Blanco will be seated at a table there ready to sign and inscribe your books. There will also be extra books for sale if you'd like to purchase one, or if you just want to stop by the table since we're a small group and say hello to Mr. Blanco at the table. Just a formal line there and keep your 6 foot of distance and your mask. And if you want a socially distanced picture with Mr. Blanco, you can certainly ask one of the staff members and we'd be happy to take a picture on your phone with you and the authors. Sometimes people like that. So with that, I will now introduce and pass the mic to Guido Arochi, consul at the Consulate General in Mexico in Dallas, who will introduce our featured author. Guido Arochi was born in Mexico City. Since 2016, he has served as consul at the Consulate General of Mexico in Dallas and head of mobile services, cultural and community affairs. Guido Arochi holds a degree in international relations from the School of Political and Social Science at Universidad Nacional Autónoma de México. In addition, he studied French and Swiss political systems at École Alemania in Lausanne, Switzerland. From 2013 to 2016, Guido Arochi was the Deputy General Director of the Institute for Mexicans Abroad and at the Mexican Ministry of Foreign Affairs. He's been Consul for Community Affairs at the Consulate of Mexico in Salt Lake City and Raleigh, North Carolina. During his professional career, he has worked at the Center to Prevent Discrimination in Mexico, Mexico's National Electoral Institute, La Crónica de Hoy newspaper, and the Economics Research Institute at UNAM. Guido Arochi lives and rides his road bicycle in Plano, Texas, with his wife Marina, his son Martin, and his daughter Celeste. Please give a warm welcome to Guido Arochi.
Hello, I want to say muchas gracias. Thank you to Dallas Museum of Art, and also thank you to Carolee Klimchuk for reaching out again with the Consulate General of Mexico in Dallas and to invite us to share and collaborate. I feel honored to participate today to say a few words and ideas about Richard Blanco poetry and commitment. Let me start with this sentence at the beginning of How to Love a Country. Dime con quién andas y te diré quién eres. Tell me with whom you walk, and I'll tell you who you are. A very powerful proverb, a refrán, as we say in Spanish, chosen by Richard Blanco to invite us to read him and to remind us the importance to read with him, to think of ourselves and everybody else. While we learn every day new ways to love a country, the country of our children, our country, our countries. And while reading and enjoying Richard Blanco poems like Dreaming a Wall, Complaint of El Río Grande, and Como tú, like you, like me, I thought immediately about how the US and Mexico, maybe Mexico in Texas, Dallas in Mexico, about how we always end up walking together. And that's who we are. Neighbors, relatives, family, roommates, learning every day new ways to love and build our countries, our region, our families. I thought also about my first encounter with Cuban writers, like Concierto Barroco by Alejo Carpentier, or like El Mundo Alucinante by Reinaldo Arenas, both writing about characters discovering and recognizing themselves in Mexico. Reinaldo Arenas, another artist, writer, who was born in Cuba and migrated to the US. He died in New York. I thought also about Richard Blanco, in his own words, as having a soul made in Cuba, assembled in Spain, and then imported to the United States, to become the first immigrant, Latino, and gay person to write and read the official US presidential inauguration poem in 2013. With a simultaneous career as a civil engineer for 20 years, Richard Blanco has designed bridges and roads, and as a poet, he has observed the emotional toll and philosophical dilemmas of all of us crossing cultural bridges and witnessing the constant transformation of our natural landscape and political borders. As he has clearly observed, the best poems raise questions rather than provide answers. Something Blanco work asks is, how do so many of us find it difficult to feel at home, to feel a sense of belonging, even when in our own home, our own country, or our own family? Richard Blanco invites the reader to inhabit the poem with him, to traverse a physical and emotional landscape together, and then, in a few crafted lines, can bring us from tearful remembrance to laughter about family, community, and society in a single work. Please help me to welcome Richard Blanco.
Thank you, Guido. Thank you for that wonderful and very poetic introduction. Thank you for walking with us today. Thank all of you for letting me walk with you and inviting you to walk with me. It is a pleasure to be here in person finally. I don't know if you know the history, but we've been trying to do this for a couple of years, and I know part of it is virtual, so I welcome the virtual audience as well. It really is just been wonderful to experience this exhibit even virtually, and now to see it in person. As you can imagine, to speak to it today through my poetry and share with you what that exhibit has brought out for me, which is so in line with my work, as Guido had sort of alluded to in many ways. They say that every writer is in some ways writing one poem all their life. And what that means, figuratively, of course, is that usually a poet's body of work is centered on some kind of central obsession or question. For me, that comes down to one single word, and that is home. Home, and all that big word calls into mind in terms of community, family, heritage, identities of all kinds, even sexuality. A question that or a word and question that's as big as asking what is love, right? It's like, in some ways, a question you never quite answer, an obsession that never quite leaves you, and still part of a large part of my body of work. An obsession that's been with me since before I was born. As Guido said, I was made in Cuba, assembled in Spain, and imported to the United States, which meant my mother left Cuba 7 months pregnant. So I was made in Cuba. My soul is Cuban. To Madrid, where I was born. And 45 days after my birth, we immigrated to the United States. I like to show this slide because it sort of it tells a little bit of that story. That's my newborn photo from Madrid, and that was also my green card photo. So that narrative, that obsession of home began back then. I like to show that photo too because I still got good hair. But also, I remember looking at this as a little kid and going, "What is the Eiffel Tower doing in here?" I thought I was born in Spain and we're from Cuba and we're in the United States. So I was like, what the hell is going on here? So it's kind of, I do remember looking at that as a little kid and going like, where am I from? What is this thing called home? By that time, by 45 days old, I belonged to 3 countries, Cuba, Spain, and the United States, and yet to none, really. And as such, you can imagine how this exhibit speaks to me in that sense. When the DMA asked me to write a poem for the exhibit, it was a definite yes, obviously, because figuratively, I've been migrating all my life, sometimes physically, but also just psychologically and emotionally. And I'd like to sort of take you on a narrative of that search for home through some of my poems throughout books and end with the pièce de résistance, the poem that I read, inspired by the exhibition. This first poem was actually, again, ironically, has to deal with Thanksgiving. So this is the Blanco family Thanksgiving, which inevitably turns into spandex and dancing. And this is the Thanksgiving of the white family, the one I always thought we should behave like and be like. But in any case, you'll see little Ricky, which is me, what I call myself, Ricardito, sort of in this poem navigating his sense of a cultural home, right? And this is from a very young age. Ironically, or I should say serendipitously, it was also my very first poetry assignment in my very first creative writing class in my MFA program, which was write a poem about America. When Obama called and asked me to write a poem for the United States, I said, don't worry, big guy, I got this one. It's the same assignment. I've been doing this for 20 years. I didn't say that. Believe me, I didn't say that. But anyways, you just need to know 3 things for this poem. I think Cubans, but I think Latinx folks in general, we still don't get Thanksgiving. We call it Sangiving, like San Ignacio, San Jose, San Francisco. It's a whole different kind of feast day. For the other thing, for Cubans, pork is not the other white meat, it's the only meat. And there's a reference here to JFK, which of course deals back to the Bay of Pigs invasion and whatnot. Anyway, here I go. And I named the poem América. This is from a child's point of view, obviously, or voice or tone. Although Tia Miriam boasted she discovered at least half a dozen uses for peanut butter, topping for guava shells and syrup, butter substitute for Cuban toast, hair conditioner and relaxer, Mama never knew what to make of the monthly 5-pound jars handed out by the immigration department until my friend Jeff mentioned jelly. There was always pork, though, for every birthday and wedding, whole ones on Christmas and New Year's Eves, even on Thanksgiving Day. Pork, fried, broiled, or crispy skin roasted, as well as cauldrons of black beans, fried plantain chips, and yuca con mojito. These items required a special visit to Antonio's Mercado on the corner of 8th Street, where men in guayaberas stood in Senate blaming Kennedy for everything. Ese hijo de puta. The bile of Cuban coffee and cigar residue filling the creases of their wrinkled lips, clinging to one another's lies of lost wealth, ashamed and empty as hollow trees. By 7, I had grown suspicious. We were still here. Overheard conversations about returning to Cuba had grown wistful and less frequent. I spoke English. My parents didn't. We didn't live in a 2-story house with a maid or a wood panel station wagon, nor vacation camping in Colorado. None of the girls in my family had hair of gold. None of my brothers or cousins were named Greg, Peter, or Marcia. We were not the Brady Bunch. And none of the black and white characters on Donna Reed or the Dick Van Dyke Show were named Guadalupe, Lázaro, and Mercedes. Patty Duke's family wasn't like us either. They didn't have pork on Thanksgiving. They ate turkey with cranberry sauce. They didn't have yuca. They had yams, like the diddles of pilgrims that I colored in class. So, a week before Thanksgiving, I explained to my abuelita about the Indians and Mayflower, how Lincoln set the slaves free. I explained to my parents about the Purple Mountain's majesty, one if by land, two if by sea, the cherry tree, the Tea Party, the amber waves of grain, the masses yearning to be free, liberty and justice for all, until finally they agreed this Thanksgiving we would have turkey, as well as pork. Abuelita prepared the poor fowl as committing an act of treason, faking her enthusiasm for my sake. Mama set a frozen pumpkin pie in the oven and prepared candied yams, following instructions I had to translate from the marshmallow bag. The table was arrayed with gladiolas. The plattered turkey loomed at the center in plastic silver from Woolworths. I uttered a bilingual blessing, and the turkey was passed around like a game of Russian roulette. Dry, Gilberto complained, and proceeded to drown the lean slices with pork fat drippings and cranberry jelly, la mierda roja esa, as he called it. Faces fell when Mama presented her ochre pie. Pumpkin, calabaza, was a home remedy for ulcers, not a dessert. Tia Maria made 3 rounds of Cuban coffee, then Abuelo and Pepe cleared the living room furniture, put on a Celia Cruz LP, and the entire family began to merengue over the linoleum of our apartment, sweating rum and coffee, until they remembered it was 1976 and 46 degrees in America. Thank you. So it was obviously a very early poem, from the first poem from my first book. Obviously, that obsession about home and home and belonging, and that constant search and migration in some ways has been with me and continues to be with me. It's a question I often think most cogently in the context of my mother. This is my mother, obviously. Old picture of her in Cuba long before I think I was even an idea. And that's her with me at the presidential inauguration. She's the person who sat by my side. So my mother left her entire family behind in Cuba. And by that I mean her parents, her 8 brothers and sisters, every aunt and uncle, every niece and nephew, every cousin, every living relative. Not to say everything she ever knew in all her life, for the sake of following the American dream. And I always understood, I sort of always grew up thinking about that, feeling my mother's sorrow and longing and her courage. But I never realized that her story is also one of incredible faith in the ideals and the promises of this country. And so, as I like to say, my mother is more of an American than I could ever be in my entire life. And she's the one who should have written and read that poem in Washington. And I think we all agree in this room that immigrants remind us and hold America up to a certain bar, and remind us of what we promise the world. So this poem asks us to imagine ourselves in my mother's emotional shoes. And if we all had to get up out of this room tonight and pack a bag like the exhibit, what would you do? How might we fight for what we need to fight for a little bit more? How might we have more empathy for each other? How might we have conversations that we need to have if we knew what was at stake? This is also the 3rd poem that the White House asked me to write. They asked me to write 3 poems, and they chose one today, which I'll read later. It's called Mother Country, or Madre Patria. To love a country as if we've lost one. 1968, my mother leaves Cuba for America, a scene I imagine as if standing in her place. 1 foot inside a plane destined for a country she knew only as a name, a color on a map, or glossy photos from drugstore magazines. Her other foot anchored to the platform of her patria, her hand clutched around one suitcase, taking only what she needs most. Hand-colored photographs of her family, her wedding veil, the doorknob of her house, a jar of dirt from her backyard, goodbye letters she won't open for years. The sorrowful drone of engines, one last deep breath of familiar air she'll take with her. One last glimpse at all she'd ever known. The palm trees wave goodbye as she steps onto the plain. The mountains shrink from her eyes as she lifts off into another life to love a country, as if we've lost one. I hear her, once upon a time, reading picture books over my shoulder at bedtime, both of us learning English, sounding out words as strange as the talking animals and fair-haired princes in their pages. I taste her first attempts at macaroni and cheese, but with chorizo and peppers. And her shame over Thanksgiving turkeys, always dry, but countered by her perfect pork pernil and garlic yuca. I smell the rain of those mornings, huddled as one under one umbrella, waiting for the bus to her 10-hour days at the cash register. And at night, the zzz, zzz of her sewing her own blouses and quinceañera dresses for her grown nieces still in Cuba, guessing at their sizes. And the gowns she sold to neighbors to save for a rusty white sedan, no hubcaps, no air conditioning, sweating all the way through our first vacation to Florida theme parks to love a country, as if you've lost one. As if it were you on a plane departing from America forever. Clouds closing like curtains on your country, the last scene in which you're a madman scribbling the names of your favorite flowers, trees, and birds you'd never see again. Your address and phone number you'd never use again. The color of your father's eyes and your mother's hair, terrified you could somehow, someday, forget these. To love a country. As if I was my mother last spring, hobbling, insisting I help her climb all the way up to the U.S. Capitol, as if she were here before you today instead of me, explaining her tears, her cheeks pink as the cherry blossoms coloring the air that day, when she stopped, turned to me, and said, "You know, mijo, it isn't where you're born that matters. It's where you choose to die. That's your country." Thank you. So I love what she says, because there's a really big difference between dying for one's country and the country that you choose to die in. And the embrace of so much that she lost, but also how much her life means now in this country. And having raised two wonderful sons that call her every day, how much of her life has been made here, and how much she's embraced this country as her own, has lived here more than in Cuba. This is I always, when I read a father poem, I know their poem, I always feel like I gotta read a father poem. But also I love to show that slide for the plastic covered sofa. Been meaning to write a poem, ode to the plastic covered sofa. It's an immigrant staple. It's one thing to have one. Well, we're in Texas, not the best feeling in the heat when you get up, but your skin doesn't. But anyway, that's my father, and my older brother, myself as a toddler, obviously. My father died when I was really young, about 22, and I never really got to have a sort of an adult relationship with him. I never really got to dive into his story as I did with my mother. And in a sense, this is a poem to dive into his story, but mostly it's a poem of thanks, of admiration for his own sort of version of his own immigrant story, his own migration, if you will. It's really weird where poems come from. Where this poem came from has obsessed me since I was like 8. This little word in the poem. And I just wrote it down. And it was my first poem in the New Yorker. Like sometimes you're just like, you think you know what you're doing, right? And then somehow these magical moments happen that took me since I was 8 to write down in some ways. It's called My Father in English. First half of his life lived in Spanish, the long syntax of las montañas that lined his village, the rhyme of sol with his soul, a Cuban alma that swayed with las palmas, the sharp rhythm of his machete cutting through caña, the syllables of his canarios that sung into la brisa of his island home, which he left, to spell out the second half of his life in English, in the vernacular of New York City sleet, neon, and glass, and the brick factory where he learned to polish steel 12 hours a day. Enough to save enough to buy a used Spanish-English dictionary he kept bedside like a Bible, studied 15 new words after his prayers each night, then practiced them on us the next day. Buenos dias, indeed, my family. Indeed, más café. Have a good day today, indeed. And again in the evening, gracias to my bella wife, indeed, for dinner. ¿Hiciste tu homework? Indeed. La vida es indeed difícil. Indeed did indeed become his favorite word, which, like the rest of his new life, he never quite grasped. Overused and misused often, to my embarrassment. Yet the word I most learned to love and know him through. Indeed, the exile who tried to master the language he chose to master him. Indeed, the husband who refused to say, I love you in English to my mother. Indeed, the man who died without true translation. Indeed, meaning in fact and effecto, meaning in reality, the hecho, meaning to say now what I've always meant to tell him in both languages. Thank you. Gracias. For surrendering the past tense of your life so that I might conjugate myself here in the present of this country. In truth, así es. Indeed. Thanks. So I often think of migration or immigration, my own story, collectively in generationally, right? In generational terms. We often think that, we're not, or sometimes we don't, we're not completely cognizant of like where we've landed and what lives we've made for ourselves and the places that we live. And we think, okay, like I am Richard Blanco and I live in Miami and I became an engineer and a poet. And you don't realize that in some ways who you become or who you are, what your journey is really started way before you were born. Right? And decisions that were made by people on their own migrations, in their own journeys, that affect. And it kind of like really freaks me out, that thought, what if my great-grandparents had just made one different decision? Who would I be today? Would I be the same person, just in a different country? Would things have completely changed? And I think we can see that. I don't know, at least the exhibit really caught my eye in that, like, because, it's not only the people that move, but also the generations that come after you move, and then, like all those ripple effects. And this poem is kind of a contemplation of that, an imaginative, somewhat imaginative complex contemplation. Something that I think I'm going to do as a next project is to dive much deeper. Unfortunately, I did my DNA, I was going to say it, my DMA test, but that's another, I already did that one, right? I wrote the poem. My DNA testing, and I thought I was going to do something really radical. Like I always want to be sort of Italian and Jewish or something like that. Turns out I'm 49% Portuguese, which I was like, kind of, where did that come from? 5% indigenous Yucatan, 5% Irish. So I'm thinking I want to take this poem and really research it and maybe think about some more of what my migration has been. So, yeah, this is that kind of poem of consequence, inconsequently. A bearded shepherd in a gray wool vest, a beret lowered to his brow. That's how my blood has always imagined the man who was my great-grandfather. His eyes hazel, I was told once. But I'll never see what he saw of his life in the cold rivers of Asturias. I can only imagine the fog caressing the hills of his village and him watching from the window of the train he took to Sevilla for love, my mother explained to me once, holding a ghost of him in a photo on his wedding day with an ascot tie and button shoes, standing in a room filled with mahogany and red roses. Were they red? What color were the tears of Spanish lace cascading from my great-grandmother's dress? Nothing can speak for them now. Tell me what they saw in their eyes that morning they left for love, or for war, or for both. Crossing the sea to Cuba, to Cuban palms and cane fields, quietly sweetening under the quiet sun. But what if they had never met? What color would my eyes be? Who would I be now? Had they gone to Johannesburg instead, or Maracaibo, or not left Sevilla at all? Into what seas would I have cast thoughts? What other cities would I have drowned in? The countries I would have lost or betrayed, the languages I would speak or not speak, the names that would have been my names. I'd like to believe I've willed every detail of my life, but I am a consequence, a drop of rain, of seeds fallen by chance here, in the middle of a story I don't know, having to finish it and call it my own. And in part, I think that when I got that great big call from the White House, that there's a real strong sense of that moment was only possible because of the decisions my parents had made. And it almost was like this transition of, okay, their story has kind of finally folded into my story. And the idea that was, for me, it was the sort of the final, not the final, but the peak reason of why they did all this. And trying to understand how to honor their story, but then also how to continue to write mine. It took me that long to sort of think about that. So in that quest for home, in my migrations of one kind or another, I ended up going to Cuba in my mid-20s in 1990. I want to say returned to Cuba because I felt like I had been there already because of growing up with so much Cuba and then growing up in the Republic of Miami, so the facsimile of Cuba. So it did feel like a returning psychologically. And it was an incredible experience, you can imagine, to see all these stories come to life. All these things that were just black and white photos or were letters or were family lore. And then also, since so little has changed in Cuba, because of the economics, it was, still in the 1950s cars, your grandfather's little house hasn't been torn down to put a shopping center. So it really messes with your mind because you really feel like you're walking and taking a time machine and going back to this place. But yet there was some part of me that realized this is not mine, right? Not fully mine. This is still my parents' Cuba. And the very reality that I couldn't have a real honest relationship with the island because there's no diplomatic relations, even though we got close for a while, and that was part of the journey. But that the Cuba that I was looking for ultimately belonged to my parents, and that Cuba had become its own space too, and I was fine with that. So I decided, well, okay, well maybe I'll finally move to America and leave Miami, as Liz Balmaceda likes to say. We love living in Miami because it's so close to the United States, and you don't need a passport or a passport, as Latinos like to say. So I moved. I took a job. I lived on Miami Beach, on the water. I took a job in Hartford, Connecticut, thinking oh boy, sleigh rides in the snow and everybody singing jingle bells in a one horse hope and say. Um, One country in the visible. Pilgrims everywhere with those wonderful, cool pilgrim shoes. Um, Martha Stewart and me doing arts and crafts in Westport every Tuesday, et cetera, et cetera. I still grew up very much that fantasy that there was this quintessential America that was somewhere north of the Miami-Dade County line. And of course, that fantasy didn't work out. There are parts of New England that, of course, do sort of echo that. So I thought, well, if I'm not really American, I'm not really Cuban, what the hell am I? And so I became an avid traveler. I got the travel bug, and carrying those same questions of home and belonging in my suitcase, figuratively, and thinking, okay, well, maybe home is Venice. Maybe that's my long lost home. Maybe home is, I don't know, um, Stockholm. Who knows? I'm like, I'm going on the road. I'm migrating. I'm going to find this place that I belong to. But what I realized in traveling, and it's all recorded in the second book, a lot of travel poems. Nothing raises our questions about home more than traveling, right? Because let's face it, there's always kind of a little agenda when we travel that is really almost primordial. This urge, this human drive to essentially find paradise, right? Like, and so we go on vacation and oh, this is so wonderful. And oh my God, and you start looking at the real estate ads and you're like, oh, honey, look how cheap it is. We got to get in on the ground floor on this. And you're like, and every place is fine for about 3 days. So you realize people are just people. They're going to work. They're screaming at their kids. They're getting into finance. But but it is really a driving fundamental force that I see echoed very much in the exhibit. We're driven. We're driven for two things. One is stability, and the other one is exploration. And also, you know, it's in all our traditions of faith and our folklore. It's in our literature. It's in our museum. This perpetual quest to find that home, that sense of place, and that promise of paradise. It's kind of part of the fundamental human condition in many ways. And so this poem is a travel poem, and it's kind of a humorous look or a whimsical look at that kind of psychotic quest for home and when we travel, or that idea of overly romanticizing a place that we want to belong to. So I'll just need to know two things for this poem. There's some brochure language in here. There's some really boring language in here that's from a brochure. It's not mine. I don't write, so it's meant to be like a counterbalance to this flat, you know, how to describe a place that really says nothing about the place, honestly. And then I'll do my best to do a Cuban Norwegian accent. We're not going to Malta because the winds are too strong, our captain announces, his voice like an oracle coming through the loudspeakers of every lounge and hall, as if the ship itself were speaking. We're not going to Malta, an enchanting island country 50 miles from Sicily, according to the brochure of the tour we're not taking. But what if we did go to Malta? What if, as we were escorted on foot through this walled city of Medea, the walls begin speaking to me? And after we stop a few minutes to admire the impressive architecture, I feel Malta could be the place for me. What if, as we stroll the bastions to admire the panoramic harbor and stunning countryside, I dream of buying a little Maltese farm, raising Maltese horses in the green Maltese hills? What if, after we see the cathedral and Mosta saved by a miracle, I believe that Malta itself is a miracle? And before I'm transported back to the pier with a complimentary beverage, I'm struck with Malta fever, discover I'm very Maltese indeed, and decide I must return to Malta, learn to speak Maltese with an English or Spanish accent, work as a Maltese professor of English at the University of Malta, and teach a course on the Maltese falcon. Or what if, when we stop at a factory to shop for famous Maltese ware, I discover that making Maltese crosses is my true passion? Yes, Yes, I'd get a Maltese cat and a Maltese dog, make Maltese friends, drink malted milk, join the Knights of Malta, and be happy for the rest of my Maltesian life. But we're not going to Malta. Malta is drifting past us, or we are drifting past it. An amorphous hump of green and brown bobbing in the portholes with the horizon as a ship heaves over whitecaps, wisping into rainbows for just a moment, then dissolving into nothing, back into the sea. Thank you. So, a couple of epilogues to that. So my mother did go to Malta, and my mother doesn't matter. She just goes with the church ladies, so she could be anywhere. It doesn't really matter. And I was like, Mom, how's Malta? She was like, it's dusty. And then I recently met a friend in Ketchum, Idaho, of all places, whose father was a Knight of Malta, and he has the whole Knight of Malta regalia, and I was honorarily knighted as a Knight of Malta. Anyway, I still yet to go to Malta. I came across after the travel bug, I came across this quote by Pascal that says, "The sole cause of a man's unhappiness is that he does not know how to stay quietly in his room." It's a line that Elizabeth Bishop uses in one of my favorite poems. And so I thought, what was that room that I left? Maybe this quest for home, this constant migration has been a wild kind of goose chase. And I decided, well, maybe the only place I really belong, my room, is Miami. And so I moved back to Miami, to South Florida, the world of my childhood. And that didn't quite pan out either. And so this poem sort of speaks to that old adage of you can't go back home, but a little more complex than that. What happened is I moved back, started trying to take that proverbial trip down memory lane to every place I'd ever been, and thinking nothing had changed in I hadn't been in like 8 years, but I went to Marco Island to visit this place that was we used to vacation a lot, staycation, poor man's vacation. That had been like 25 years, and I thought, surely nothing's changed, because in my mind, nothing's changed, and so therefore the world doesn't change. And of course, that's not what happened. But what I discovered, I started cussing like a sailor and like all pissed off and like, which is not completely unrare for a Cuban, but it was doing a Ricky Ricardo, and my partner's like, "You sound just like your mother." And I'm like, that's not a good thing to say. And I realized that I was talking about Marco Island in the same way that my parents used to talk about Cuba. And so I realized that Marco Island, in a way, became my Cuba. But also the idea that loss and the constant movement and migration are just part of the human condition. And this really has nothing to do with Cuba in a sense. It's my own lifetime. And so I understood that. And I think we all have a place like this in our life, like the Gulf Motel, a place that we have migrated from, either physically, emotionally, or psychologically. So I invite you to think about that place as I share my Gulf Motel with you. Looking for the Gulf Motel, Marco Island, Florida. There should be nothing here I don't remember. The Gulf Motel with mermaid lampposts and ship's wheel in the lobby should still be rising out of the sand like a cake decoration. My brother and I should still be pretending we don't know our parents, embarrassing us as they roll the luggage cart past the front desk, loaded with our scruffy suitcases, 24 loaves of Cuban bread, brown bags bulging with enough mangoes to last the entire week, our espresso pot, the pressure cooker, and a pork roast reeking garlic through the marble lobby. All because we can't afford to eat out, mijo. Not even on vacation. Only 2 hours from our home in Miami, but far enough away to be thrilled by the wider sands on the west coast of Florida, where I should still be, for the first time, watching the sun set instead of rise over the ocean. There should be nothing here I don't remember. My mother should still be in the kitchenette of the Gulf Motel, her daisy sandals from Kmart still squeaking across the linoleum, still gorgeous in her teal swimsuit and amber earrings, stirring a pot of arroz con pollo, adding sprinkles of onion powder and dollops of tomato sauce. My father should still be in a terry cloth jacket, smoking, clinking a glass of amber whiskey in the sunset at the Gulf Motel, watching us dive into the pool, two sons he'll never see grow into men who will be proud of him. There should be nothing here I don't remember. My brother and I should still be playing parcheesi. My father should still be alive, slow dancing with my mother on the sliding glass balcony of the Gulf Motel. No music, only the waves keeping time. A song only their minds hear, 10,000 nights back to their life in Cuba. My mother's face should still be resting against his bare chest, like the moon resting on the sea. And the stars should still be turning around them. There should be nothing here I don't remember. My brother should still be 13, sneaking rum in the bathroom and sculpting naked women from sand. And I should still be 8 years old, dazzled by seashells and how many seconds I can hold my breath underwater. But I'm not. I'm 38, driving up Collier Boulevard, looking for the Gulf Motel, for everything that should still be, but isn't. I want to blame the condos, their shadows for ruining the beach and my past. I want to chase the snowbirds away with their tacky McMansions and yachts. I want to turn the golf courses back into mangroves. I want to find the Gulf Motel exactly as it was and pretend for just a moment that nothing lost is lost. Okay, good. Thanks. Still haven't found the Gulf Motel. I've made new Gulf Motels. So I moved to, what happens when things don't work out in Miami, you of course move to Maine, the other end of 95, of I-95. And I had sort of given up on the quest or the question of home and thought, well, maybe I'll just live in the question, I should say. As Basho said, life is a journey and the journey itself is home. And I was just kind of, okay, I'll just sit here in Maine and look at the trees and not worry about, there's a wonderful saying in English, in Spanish called desterrado, which really has no translation. And that's what I felt like. And then big guy called, like I said, and said, write a poem about America. And I thought, oh God, here we go again. Like all those questions about, wait, I thought I'd finished this journey, right? I thought I finished this migration. I thought I found a place, even if that place was no place in a way. And of course, just thinking about, again, am I American? Am I Cuban? What's going on? What am I living in Maine? So the inaugural response ended up being, in a way, a very personal response, as well as a collective response to the idea and question of home. But more than just to me, but what does it mean to all of us, right? So who are we in this landscape of this country? And what I discovered, in a sense, a new connection with America. I never felt 100% American. In fact, when they asked me to write the poem, that was the hardest part, is do I love this country enough to write a poem about it? Does this country love me back enough that I can write a poem about it? And the whole process of the poem and the experience taught me that indeed my narrative as a little Cuban, chubby, gay, immigrant, Cuban American kid from a working class suburb of Miami, that's part of the American narrative. That by definition in a democracy, that all of our narratives belong, right? It's in our motto, out of the many one. Are we there yet? God knows we're not there yet. But I also realized that America, like a poem, is a work in progress, and sometimes there are bad days, or a whole stanzas you got to throw out the window, and then there are good days. But the idea is that democracy is not a noun; it's a verb. We don't live in a democracy, right? It's not like check, we're done. Like, oh, democracy, it's done. We participate in one, and I think we all know that it's more relevant today more than ever. In any case, I'll share the inaugural poem with you, and then should be ending right around 8:30. So we're doing okay on time, I think. I feel fast, but then Cubans always feel like, don't give a Cuban a mic, as I like to say. I'll keep you here till 10 o'clock. No, just kidding. So I want to read you a little preface from the memoir that I wrote about the experience, and then the poem, and then a couple more poems, and then we'll end. So I'm here somewhere waiting to be called up to the podium. Nice view, huh? This is, my partner took that. Just get a little water for that. In the moment, I feel America standing as one, putting differences aside and taking a deep collective breath. We pay tribute to something far bigger and more important than any one of us. And I truly feel like one of us, one of we, the people, in the echoes of the president's and others' speeches. I embrace America in a way I never had or thought I could, feeling for the first time that I truly belong to one country. Not an imaginary ideal from TV or a nostalgic Cuba floating in the sea of my parents' memories, but a real tangible place that is mine, was mine, all along. Senator Schumer introduces me and calls me up to the podium. My mother squeezes my shoulder. I stand more confident than I imagined I would or could be, transfixed by the moment that is no longer about me or my poem or my glory, but about our country. Still, I'm surprised when the president and vice president stand up to greet me and shake my hand on the way to the podium. They both whisper something in my ear that I can't make out, but their gracious gestures speak silently to my heart. Silently, as if saying, Richard, here is your country. This is your story. This is your home. I step up to the podium, look out over the crowd, a patchwork quilt of lives, of stories spread across our ground, under our sky, beneath our one sun. I take it all in as I take one deep breath and then another. This is for them. This is for us, for all of us. I think to myself and begin speaking into our wind. Mr. President, Mr. Vice President, America, one today. One sun rose on us today, kindled over our shores, peeking over the Smokies, greeting the faces of the Great Lakes, spreading a simple truth across the Great Plains, then charging over the Rockies. One light, waking up rooftops, under each one a story, told by our silent gestures moving behind our windows. My face, your face, millions of faces in morning's mirrors, each one yawning to life, crescendoing into our day. Pencil yellow school buses, the rhythm of traffic lights, fruit stands, apples, limes, and oranges arrayed like rainbows begging our praise. Silver trucks heavy with oil or paper, bricks or milk, teeming over highways alongside us, on our way to clean tables, read ledgers, or save lives, to teach geometry or ring up groceries as my mother did for 20 years, so I could write this poem for us today. All of us, as vital as the one light we move through. The same light on blackboards with lessons for the day, equations to solve, history to question, or atoms imagined. The I have a dream, we keep dreaming. Or the impossible vocabulary of sorrow that won't explain the empty deaths of 20 children marked absent today and forever. Many prayers, but one light. Breathing color into stained glass windows, life into the faces of bronze statues, warmth onto the steps of our museums and park benches as mothers watch their children slide into the day. One ground, our ground, rooting us to every stalk of corn, every head of wheat sown by sweat and hands, hands gleaning coal or planting windmills in deserts and hilltops that keep us warm, hands digging trenches, hands routing pipes and cables, hands as worn as my father's cutting sugarcane so my brother and I could have books and shoes. The dust of our farms and deserts, our cities and plains mingled by one wind, our breath. Breathe. Hear it through the day's gorgeous din of honking cabs, buses launching down avenues, the symphony of footsteps, guitars, and screeching subways, the unexpected songbird on your clothesline. Hear squeaky playground swings, trains whistling, or whispers across cafe tables. Hear the doors we open for each other all day, saying, hello, shalom, buongiorno, howdy, namaste, or buenos dias, in the language my mother taught me, in every language, spoken into one wind, carrying our lives without prejudice as these words break from my lips. One sky since the Appalachians and Sierras claimed their majesty, and the Mississippi and Colorado worked their way to the sea. Thank the work of our hands, weaving steel into bridges, finishing one more report for the boss on time, stitching another wound or uniform. The first brushstroke on a portrait, or the last floor on the Freedom Tower jutting into a sky that yields to our resilience, one sky toward which we sometimes lift our eyes, tired from work. Some days guessing at the weather of our lives, some days giving thanks for love that loves you back, sometimes praising a mother who knew how to give, or forgiving a father who couldn't give what you wanted. Still, we head home. Home to the gloss of rain or weight of snow or the plum blush of dusk, but always, always home, always under one sky, our sky, and always one moon, like a silent drum tapping on every rooftop and every window of one country, all of us facing the stars and hope. A new constellation, still waiting for us to map it, still waiting for us to name it together. Thank you. That poem, to me, obviously feels more important than it even was back then. It's become sort of more of a reminder, or to become, I guess, for me, more urgent. But anyway, the whole experience of the inauguration led me to this poem, this book collection of what is How to Love a Country. Because I began to thinking and ask myself, well, what is a country anyway, right? How do we love such a thing? Can we even love certain countries? What happens when a country changes? And also thinking about country and the idea of home, but collectively, not just what it means to my Cuban American world. And that's essentially what this book comes to bear upon, both historically in the present and the future. And I just want to share one poem in honor of Mr. Rochi and his presence and wonderful introduction today, and then I'll read the migration poem. The migration. This is an immigration poem, and you mentioned this in the introduction. This was part of a project. It's in the book, but it was also a collaborative project with a photographer named Jacob Hessler. And this is obviously at Río Grande, where it forms part of the Mexican-U.S. border. And I guess what I wanted to contemplate in this poem is the absurdity of borders, right? Like you were saying, we're all walking together and thinking about how absurd borders are, becoming even more absurd in a 21st century world. And that borders in some ways are just inventions, right? They're inventions for the sake of geopolitical power, wealth, et cetera. And this idea, especially in this region, as if you cross this line, suddenly you're in a different world, a region that shares hundreds and hundreds of years of history and culture and whatnot. Complicated one, that's for sure. So I thought the only way to really address such a complicated issue was to let the river speak and sort of give it to all of humanity for the absurdity of borders, of having to create this, what is a false distinction. Can't wait for the aliens to land, so we can say, I'm not from Dallas, I'm from Earth, you know, or I'm not from the United States, I'm from Earth. But then we'll start fighting the aliens, so never mind. So this is again a persona or personification poem in the voice of El Rio, of the Rio Grande. I was meant for all things to meet, to make the clouds pause in the mirror of my waters, to be home to fallen rain that finds its way to me, to turn eons of loveless rock into love-sick pebbles and carry them as humble gifts back to the sea, which brings life back to me. I felt the sun flare, praised each star flocked about the moon long before you did. I breathed air you'll never breathe. Listened to songbirds before you could speak their names, before you dug your oars in me, before you created the gods that created you. Then countries, your invention. Maps jigsawing the world into colored shapes, caged in bold lines to say you're here, not there. You're this, not that. To say yellow is in red, red is in black, black is not white. To say mine, not ours. To say war, and believe life's worth is relative. You named me. Big river drew me, blue, blue and thick to divide, to say spick and Yankee, to say wetback and gringo. You split me in two, half of me us, the rest other. But I wasn't meant to drown children, hear mothers' cries. Never meant to be your geography, a line, a border, a murderer. I was meant for all things to meet. The mirrored clouds and sun's tingle, bird songs and the quiet moon, the wind and its dust, the rush of mountain rain, and us. Blood that runs in you is water flowing in me. Both life, both the truth we know. Thank you. Just send down this poem. So I chose this image because, as we say in poetry, it was my way into the poem. There's something very intimate, personal, and sort of about shoes and footwear, these sandals in this case. And it just started me imagining, like, who wore these? You know, like, suddenly this artifact brought the whole exhibit of real people's lives and what these objects meant, right? Because these objects in and of themselves don't mean anything unless it's really the stories that come with it, right? And so, so I began to walk in the shoes of all these artifacts in some ways. But more than that, I started to imagine in some ways, connect that piece to my own sort of imaginary migration. And like, what if I were one of these people, one of these stories behind these artifacts, or what if hundreds of or years from now, what would what would be kept sort of in the exhibit? It's it's very poetic, but think about what I would take on that journey, what would be left behind, and how would my life be, or my journey or my own migration sort of be exhibited, so to speak, both literally and literally. And then we'll take questions, right? A little bit for this. So it's called Imaginary Migrations. Though I can't hold or comfort the hands that once held these urns with their sons' or mothers' ashes, nor behold the love in the eyes of the eyes that once beheld these vases abloom with roses, though I can't drink the cascade of water or wine never poured for me from the mouths of these pitchers, nor kiss the lips that kiss these teacups, only savor the emptiness of these empty plates and hollow bowls with swirls of glazed flowers gazing back at me now. Though I can't chart the dreams once dreamed underneath the geometry of these blankets, nor caress the shoulders that donned these silk robes like butterflies' wings fleeting into the sun, though I can't alight myself to some other time, nor trace the footprints of lives erased from these rugs, though I can't wear these tattered sandals or see the souls who wore them down, these souls on their journeys, I can still imagine them as I imagine myself like them, someday having to maybe cross continents to dodge dying in the crossfire of revolution, or board a ship to save my genes from genocide, or thrash through raging whitewater to calm my ache of famine into a land of plenty and promise. Imagine what I'd take, not just to keep me alive, but to keep my life alive, my salt, my spices, to taste who it was I am. A handful of seeds to plant my favorite fruit, take root, claim some new earth. My dead father's watch still ticking with his life. My favorite coffee mug to watch my ghost rise in its steam. Imagine what I don't know I'll need as much as I will. My journal bookmarked by a petal between the last scribble of who I was and blank pages of who I will be. The doorknob I'll never turn again. A photo album my eyes will turn to greet lost faces. Imagine what only my mind could pack. My wind chimes, giggles, train whistles, a neighbor dog's yowls, the purr of night winds through my garden, or a breath of the winds I breathed, the dust of my footsteps that might have blanketed my bones asleep, the altar of mountains my eyes will never praise again, memories of clouds I've told my secrets to. Imagine how I'd scatter them into a new sky, transform the beauty of loss and the loss of beauty into the art of a new life. The sweet arias of rain recomposed over a new rooftop. The stars I'd redraw into the constellation that guided me to my new elsewhere. Imagine the moon in the ear of some new window, whispering the poems I'd write to render myself at home again in a new house of new words that someday someone might read and imagine the story of their migration from my own migration. Thank you, everyone. Oh, and I forgot to mention, so I'm not that experimental, but this is the typography. You're probably wondering, what the hell is this? So I really had a lot of fun, like sort of the trail migration, like a path, and working the typography of the poem to sort of echo this idea of movement. Any questions at all? I heard there might be some writers in the room. If you have questions just also about writing, that would be anything, my weight. I have a little gossip on Amanda and by Beyonce. Whatever you want. You don't have to reference the poems. You feel free to ask anything that comes to mind.
Okay, thanks. Hello, Mr. Blanco. My name is Roy. I'm a teacher here in the Dallas area. And my question is more of a thoughtful question from you. I teach sixth grade. What could I have told a young Richard Blanco in sixth grade that might have inspired you or turned you or moved you more towards your vision, your dream of yourself in that middle school years?
Sure. So you're saying if I were in the sixth grade to imagine myself and saying what would move me on what subject matter, English or language arts do you teach?
Science.
Science. I guess for me, I think the most powerful thing that I always come back to, and well, let me go back. I'm trying to put myself in sixth grade, which was a pretty good year. But I think what inspired me most was to know that there were people in my community, like role models, and that happened when I became writer, like Sandra Cisneros, when I was, oh my God, there's people writing like me. There's people writing about the same stuff that I'm feeling about. There's things that are happening in the world and people are thinking about it that I matter in those stories, right? So I think bringing it down to also a regional level, like just thinking about who our community is, I think, and knowing that we can rely, that we're all born out of community and we're all supported by community in some ways. I mean, it's complicated, right? It's not that easy, but I think what's always inspired me is, yeah, in a sense, role models, people that I can connect with, that I feel were like me. There was no reason for me to ever become a poet, statistically, or to even have the luxury of being in the arts, for example. So I wasn't really allowed to dream because I had no access to thinking about anything else than what were traditional careers. You can give them the example of Richard Blanco is also civil engineer, but also I don't know, in particular in science. I always like to teach students also the connections across everything, like how everything connects. That all knowledge is worth it. That all knowledge connects at some point. I started writing as a consulting engineer because my job was about 50% writing, and is when I first got into language and started owning language and started really understanding language, and that's what eventually led to a path of poetry. I hope it answers. It's a great question, but it's a hard one. But in sixth grade, I wanted some kind of. I can also think about it in the context of being a queer kid, right? There's nobody in my classroom or any classroom or any subject matter that ever talked about, oh, this astronaut is gay, or like this poet, there's none of that. So I found that there was a very lonely space where I had no connection, and therefore I didn't dream, because I was like, the things I'm thinking about, I don't see out there in the world. Nobody's sort of teaching me that.
Well, thank you, Richard. And just going back again to kids and young students, 60% of students in Dallas School District are Hispanic. And most of them, they come from mixed families, and some of them were born here, some of them they were brought here. And I think the big majority doesn't know, where they come from, or they don't. If they see something from their countries of origin or their parents, they don't know how to explain that, right? Because their parents are trying to explain that to them, and then they are living here, right? So what do you think about the power of art and literature in order to, for them to understand where they come from and feel proud about that?
Yeah. I think that's, and I don't know if this is the case here, but I think some of what I grew up in, I think it's perhaps a little misunderstood generally. I don't think you misunderstand it, but like in general, this idea that when you're born you're born as an immigrant or you come from an immigrant family, even immigrants themselves, that they embrace their given culture. And as I was trying to explain with the Thanksgiving poem, there's often a real strong sort of not completely conscious, but there's a rejection because you're like, I don't want to be. It's really sometimes I don't want to be what my parents are. They're different, right? It's a generational gap. And also culturally, they're different. I mean, I used to be embarrassed by my parents. My parents didn't know English, so I think addressing that to saying that it's okay to have that conflict is important. Not like, you should be proud of being Mexican, you should be proud of being Cuban. Like, that's often, it's what I talk about is, in my first book, actually, and it was a cultural coming of age story. And we have to sort of grow into it. And it's always there for us, but I think it's hard for them to appreciate it just on one level, on a generational level. Like saying, I think acknowledging and bringing that conversation into their classroom, I think will go a long way. I think it's a breakthrough for them sometimes. It didn't happen to me till like in my 20s. And I grew up in Miami, and it was still like sort of like, oh, I'm not gonna dance those quinces, like that's tacky, like, of course I did like 5 of them, pero obligado, I had to like, but I was enjoying them, but I didn't let myself enjoy them. So it's a really psychological thing, because you're kind of proud, but at the same time you're rejecting this, but also your parents, and I don't know if this is the case, my parents are also telling me, go in the world and be American, like go in the world and be American, but then you get too American, they're like, you're being too American, like, so I think it's something they're constantly trying to negotiate. I don't think that it's not necessarily that they're proud or not proud. I think it's, again, like this, like we do with anything in life. It's like, again, I call it a cultural coming of age. And I would share, if you look at the literature, there are a lot of, including Sandra Cisneros and many other authors who really talk about that. But I think that goes a long way to getting them over the hump and understanding that the resistance to not wanting to learn more or not knowing more is complex. It's not simple, because the parents also withhold information, right? Again, they want us. My parents are still telling me stories about Cuba, but a lot of times it took me a while till I became more interested, really realizing how much they hadn't told me about Cuba, because they wanted to spare me the confusion. They want me to spare the pain that they felt, or the struggles that they went through. And so it took me almost like going back, like an ethnographer, going back to my parents and realizing, so, the parent, it's a complex. And the parents also sort of, they don't want to sometimes inherit the kids with that burden, right? So they're not really having that conversation too. But the arts, to me, are obviously the best way to do it, whether it's a painting or a poem or a piece of music, especially by obviously Latinx authors, artists, because poetry, the arts have a way of speaking to something that includes all these nuances and includes these contradictions, and it's from an emotional sort of centered space, not sort of an intellectual space, right? It's like, what does this painting make you feel like? What is that all about? It's not like, let's just break this down and analyze it for the test. So definitely, I think the arts is the one place to have that dialogue.
Richard, it's so great to see you. Thanks for coming to us live. I've got a question. I also teach, and I have students at our institution from 140 different countries. So we talk a lot about this notion of home and what is home, and sharing your quest. Home is nostalgia, home is sort of longing. How do you find home in the present now in your life in Maine? And what is home to you?
Yeah, so I only told you part of the story. So part of what happens, I'm become Joe America, like finally American, then the State Department asked me to write a poem and read it for the reopening of the U.S. Embassy in Cuba. And so you're like, here we go again. So then I start dreaming about like, oh, well, maybe there's like this, maybe I am Cuban, or maybe I can have a little place in Cuba. And the journey of the outcome of that was that even at the age that I was about 44 back then, I was still thinking it was one or the other. I was still thinking I had to pick one. And so I started thinking more of myself as a global citizen, or the idea that this, again, that home is a constant search for many peoples, and this is a question I can ask belong to and ask and be a part of in a much larger community. And so that was one phase. And that's sort of where I've been at, and sort of also, well, like I said, also maybe before that was the idea of asking what is a country, right? Not just what's home, but who are we? Then the embassy, and where I'm writing right now, I've realized that, again, there's a saying that I think I've stolen from visual artists. Actually, it says, great art answers questions. No, good art answers questions. Great art keeps asking them. And so I'm okay with continuing to ask questions. So I'm not really ever, I know that I'll never find that one place. I think it just changes. And right now where I'm at, I'm kind of tired of like just pushing and pulling, and thinking about so many directions. So now the book I'm working on now is called In the Homeland of My Body. And I'm realizing, maybe it's midlife crisis, I don't know, but and a real closer to mortality and thinking about that. And maybe it's the pandemic too, that makes us pause, wait a minute, but realizing that all my experiences it's all happened in my body, right? Like it's all in here. All home is in here. And that you take with you anywhere, all of them, not just one of them, all of them. And so thinking about, home as the body as home, and art as home itself, that the poem itself, my art, what I make is a place I belong to. And it's still a little blurry for me, but it's a place that I landed I never thought I'd landed, because I don't know where else to go at this point. I'm still thinking about, Barcelona or something, but I know it's going to happen. And I get there a year and I'm like, oh God, Barcelona, español esto, You're going to be like, so I'm centering myself in the body. And there's something about writing itself and art. Art is an experience, right? It's an experience that we teach, show, don't tell. And the idea behind the writing and poetry is that what we're doing is replicating sensory experience. And so that our sense of self lives not here, but actually physiologically in our bodies. So I'm having a little fun with that, and really writing about really small things, writing about these huge things and how to love a country. Now I'm writing about, I cut my finger the other day and watched it heal for 2 weeks, and I wrote a poem about it. So really getting small, and sometimes I don't know, that's where I'm at right now, like home, but more so the sense that home is something you always have with you. In some ways, it's no longer just a place outside of myself anymore, and conditions may change, but that I am the sum of all those things, no matter where I go or where I happen to find myself physically. Yeah. But I still haven't found home. One more question? Questions? Oh, one more?
Okay, we have a question from Thomas in our virtual audience who would like to hear a little bit about your writing process. Do you have a certain time of the day that you like to write? Do you have a trusted reader? And how disciplined are you with your daily writing?
So my writing process is unique to me, and I think it is unique to every. I always like to preface that answer by saying that every writer's process is kind of somewhat unique to their own or has their own idiosyncrasies or whatnot. And so you'll get 50 different questions, and there's no right one answer, right? There's the right question is to ask the question so that you can explore yourself as a writer, what works for you. But I'm to answer the question more concretely, I'm a night owl writer because I had a full-time job all my life, still did till Obama called, as a civil engineer, and I had two separate selves, two separate lives, engineer by day, poet by night. So I'm always a night, I can't write in the day. I mean, I can't even talk to anybody till like 1. Like, I mean, I order like 8 shots of espresso at Starbucks, and they look at me like, okay, 8? Yes, 8. Get the big cup, and you can put 8 shots in it. So that's one thing, but you'll find that some writers like to write in the morning. It's the same idea. What you're trying to do is find that space where you're most, the BS of the world sort of can be put at bay, and so your creative mind, your better part of your mind, can enter that space a little bit more easily. And so for me, it's when all the rest is done. The cat litter's changed. I took care of all my emails. So that's one thing. The other thing is I don't write every day, and this is something that I can't stand. Sometimes that's professed that, oh, writers write every day. I think it's such a classist statement because what it says, if you don't write every day, if you're a single parent with 3 kids and you didn't write that day, you're not a writer. But again, everybody has a different answer. Some writers do write every day. I always try to tell my students, at least take a pause every moment and think like a writer. Even if you write something on a napkin, that counts, or notice something. Always try to have your eye out for something as a writer. But then I'm a binge writer. Maybe it's because I've worked so much out of memory, or my parents are so much about memory and nostalgia. I can't usually write about something exactly when it's happening, and I ferment. I do keep a little notebook with scribbles, like I said, but I won't write other than a poem here or there, or like, for example, the poem for the DMA or whatnot, or something that really strikes me. But then I know when it's time to write a book, and that's where I'm in right now. It's like, oh, time to write a book. It's usually about 2 years without writing, and then, or 2 years and a half, and then a 2.5-year gestation period. So it's longer than an elephant. But I just know when it's time to give birth to a book. And so then I'll write ferociously as much as I can, and just keep at it, like every day, like just dish out a new poem. Outside of that kind of process, I think there is this romantic notion also that of where and how we write. And again, it's very different for everybody, and it's different depending on the genre. But I have this whole office in my house in Maine, and it's like all the bookshelves and all stuff, and the desk, and the lamp, and the art hanging on the walls, and every day I'm like, this is a dump. I can't write in this space. So I write on the rug spread out with the cat on my head. Like I write on the kitchen table. There's this idea that we have to have right conditions to write, and the only right condition is when you're relaxed in your body. So that's part of it. I think letting go of that. Or not letting go, just find your own process. But I keep on asking that question to many writers. There's a great book called The Autobiographer's Handbook or Notebook, and they ask about 12 authors the same exact questions. Do you outline? You get 12 different answers. Like one, it says, and these are like Amy Tan, David Sedaris. These are like major authors. You think they'd all do the same thing, and that's a secret to success. Process is unique to each author, as unique as your own work is. And so it's about finding that space. But yeah, do you outline them? No, I do not. I outline in the beginning, then I throw it away. I outline when I get stuck. I outline at the end to make sure I didn't miss anything. I don't outline at all. Sometimes I outline. It's just 12 different. So just be aware of that. There's also, if you want a great book about process and more of a psychological process of writing, of situating yourself as a writer consciously, It's a classic. It's called Writing Down the Bones by Natalie Goldberg. I teach it to my kids. It's like 25 years old. It's like still relevant. It's kind of a contemporary classic. And that talks a lot about those spaces, how you inhabit those spaces and navigate around the infamous writer's block, which really doesn't exist, but we tell ourselves it does. So, I mean, I could go on and on, but those are a few of my idiosyncrasies. I also try to create sacred space when I write. So I light a candle, I meditate for about 45 seconds. Meditation was not invented in Cuba, because I'm a spaz. But even taking 45 seconds to just quiet your mind and I just look at the candle, you're inviting that space. You know, you're inviting something else into your world, and you're leaving the common and the ordinary. You're also leaving behind the junk language of all day. You're leaving behind the expected emotions and reactions to something, and it still ain't easy. And sometimes a poem comes, sometimes it's 3 hours of staring at the screen and going like, this is garbage. And then eventually something happens. Or like that Gulf Motel poem, for example. When I came back from Marco Island, my partner also said, that's the worst poem you've ever written. And I was like, no, it's not. It's the best poem I've ever written. Like, it says exactly what I wanted to say. It took me, in terms of process, it took me 3 years of looking at it and like, till finally saying, yes, this poem sucks. And I kept one line, which is, there should be nothing here I don't remember, and threw the rest of the poem away. And so I realized that was the only line in the poem, and that's what the poem needed to figure out. And I think processes matter from each poem too. Not every poem has the same journey. My father in English, like I said, so I've been holding that since I was 8 years old. And I was like, writing How to Love a Country, I was like, oh, I don't have a poem about my dad. I got to write a poem about my dad. And I was like, oh, indeed. Yeah, what was that? He always used to say that. Like, wrote that in like 6 hours. I can't build a career on the 6-hour poem, so that's like 1 out of every 75, maybe. So I'll again be aware that every poem has a different process too, because it depends where you're at psychologically as well. So many different things, but the point is to always, I guess in some ways, it's easy not to write. Nobody in the world is asking you to write, right? Except the DMA when they ask me to write, they write a poem. But what I'm saying is that's really the hardest thing of process is discipline in the sense of like, okay, I'm going to look at this as a writer today. I'm going to sit down for 2 years and write this book. But then, yeah, there's whole books. There's another great book called Bird by Annie Lamott that talks a lot about, and I guess what I want to say too, just as I can't shut up right now, but I see what I tell my students, there's an intersection of 3 things going on in writing, right? One is process, which mostly is psychological, really. We may think it's lighting the candle or whatever, but like Richard Hugo said, most writers' problems are like everyone else's psychological ones. Then there's craft. There's no sense of having great process if you don't, if you want to play football, you gotta practice how to throw a ball. You gotta first learn the rules of the game, right? And so that's one thing. Your process is, okay, how do I practice? What's my routine? What's my exercise routine? What do I need to work on? And so there's craft. And then another thing that gets in the way is our ego and the career of being a writer. The thing where like, I got to write the best poem in the world because I'm Richard Blanco, and that's, so managing that sense of when the aspirations for a career, and then the career when it comes to you, that's also something that intersects and can weigh in the poem. And I try to tell my students, if you want to write, first of all, if you want to be a writer, because there's a lot of people who want to be writers who just don't want to write, you know, like the romantics are going to be a writer, you know, and what it is a careerism. They're in love with the idea of being a writer, what that means in the world, because there's you know, that message out there in the media, and so that's something that weighs into craft, process, and career, and those things are all get messy. Or merge, I should say. I think there's one more question back there. Not well.
Your stories are fascinating. Comes from a very creative mind, and I love that. But somehow or another, the process comes about that you are asked to write things you mentioned. And I think it would be fascinating to learn a little bit about how some of those came about, perhaps how it came to be that you wrote a poem that was at Obama's inauguration.
Sure, and I've written several occasional or commemorative poems or commissioned poems. The inaugural poem was really, in a way, my first official occasional poem. And so that taught me a lot about, I had to do a lot of, you know, just rethinking craft, because it's like, how do you write this kind of thing? You know, nobody teaches an MFA poem. Like, I assign it now. Like, I assign like occasional poems. Like, I give them a scenario and say, write a poem about it. So what I've learned is a couple things. One, the whole idea, first of all, poetry stems from that world. Poetry for thousands of years was something communal. Poetry was oral tradition. For thousands of years before we were reading it on a page, it was the village voice. Poetry was, even in Latin American countries, poetry almost everywhere else in the world except the United States, poetry occupies a very different space. People are not terrified of poetry, and they're not like avid readers of poetry, but they're like, oh my God, poetry. So I would say there's because some more of the oral tradition has stayed in the center point, and the poem speaks about the folklore, it speaks about heroes, still speaks about so many different parts that are collective, right? And so that's something I landed on, and it's hard to find many examples in modern American poets. So you only have as models, you have Ginsberg, which is an example of what not to read at an inaugural poem, as an inaugural poem. You have Whitman, and to some degree you have Robert Frost, and then to another degree, of course, the Harlem Renaissance and feminist writers that had more of that oracular idea of like, let's write poetry that speaks to something larger than just my intimate experience. So that was part of the process. What I learned also was that it's just a misnamed thing to call something an occasional poem. It's just a poem. It's a different kind. It's not a different kind of poem. It's just a poem. Every single poem that I write has to take, the Rio Grande is in the voice of the river, there's very autobiographical first-person poems, right? There's portraiture poems. So it's just a milieu of a poem, but everybody freaks out when they have an occasional poem. But what I got to say is this: I think this is where the disconnect sometimes happens, mostly for poets. It's not about the occasion, or I should say, it's not just about the occasion. What I learned was that it's about what you feel about the occasion, and what you feel that you and your audience have in common about the occasion or about the exhibit. But isn't that what I do with every poem anyway? I want to write about my mother, but I'm also psychologically thinking, what is motherness? What details do I offer the readers that I know they will connect with perhaps their own families? And then, so the poem is, in a way, to me, becomes a kind of a mirror where the reader and the sees themselves in my life, and I see them in there in some way, and the merging of those worlds. So I'm trying to find that little connection. Give you a more because if you just write for you can't have a good forget occasional poems. Any poem that's just written out of an idea without any emotion usually falls a little flat. And by idea, I mean a passion, even if it's an intellectual passion. I don't think every poem has to be about my mother or anything like that. But if there is some passion behind it, and I think sometimes people think it's about the occasion, but they forget to include their own passions in the occasion. There is versions of this poem, and Sandra Cisneros was one of my readers. So when I wrote Mother Country, everybody was like, well, that's what one today should read like, right? Like, because it was a much more stoic, distant. And I went back to that poem and put my father in there, my mother in there, and put me in there, put emotion in there, saying, no, I'm one of these people one today. I'm not just this talking head telling America, we're one today. Like, no, I'm in there too. You know, I am thinking about this question. I'm looking at you throughout the day, but and you're looking at me, and we're looking at each other, right? So I think that was the biggest learning that, you know, and learning that's, you know, and I teach a class on this because I think it also helps students write their regular poems because they often forget about that audience. You know, they become so enclosed in their own world that they're not realizing that yes, you care about this, but there's also, you're trying to communicate something. You're trying to make an emotional communication with someone if you call yourself a writer. And being aware of that. So, and I often say like, and they look at me weird, but that's nothing. But like I often, I don't care what I tell myself, I don't care what you're writing about. I don't care about your bird. I don't care about your mother. I don't care about your father. I don't care about anything. No reader cares about anything inherently about you. It's what you feel about them. And sometimes the emotion is so left out that you're like, because what people are connecting with is your emotion. So how I feel about a tree, I can describe a tree. I can be so in love with a tree that you just want to go and like, you just love the tree too. So an occasional poem to me has been the same process. It's like, what is that one thing that I can connect with? In the inaugural poem, for example, the way in was in some ways, you'll never read this into the poem, but it was being Cuban and growing up in a very tight-knit exile community where we took care of each other because we had to for survival. And also living in a small town in Maine when there's 8 feet of snow, it don't matter who you are, no matter if you're the prince of the town, everybody has to stick together. And I kind of took that concept. I said, this is something that I think everybody not only can understand, but would want to feel, right? We want to feel that we're connected. And so the poem takes its emotional cue from that sense, right? Like we're not quite one today. We don't acknowledge that, but we are. And so that was one way. Boston Strong is another poem I wrote. So that was after the Boston Marathon bombing. And I was like, how do I write this poem? I'm not a Bostonian. I wasn't there. And you don't mess with Bostonians. Right? So my way into that was, okay, this has to be a poem about, well, there's the little boy that died was like the sandals just opened my heart up to the whole experience. And I wasn't going to write a poem about pretending that I feel what they know, what they feel. It became a poem of tribute to the people of Boston. And the emotion was tribute. The emotion was saying, you know, thinking about the experience, walking them through it, and thinking about their resiliency, and offering, you know, words of healing and hope and whatnot. Everyone's a little bit different, but isn't every poem a little bit different, right? And with the hardest poem I had to write in that sense was the reopening of the U.S. Embassy poem, because that was really close to heart and fraught with it was political minefield, like, because here I am Cuban American, and while I'm a centrist and when it comes to that regard, I used the idea of the sea, reverting the idea of how the sea connects us and not separates us. And so the idea of unity, people to people, I wasn't going to get into a political, you know, diatribe about blah, 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 or whatnot. So anyway, everyone's a little different, but it's always in any poem, it's about finding what I call the emotional core or the emotional center, which is ultimately what people are responding to in a poem, in a movie, in a piece of art. And so my favorite movie is The Notebook. Why? I have, like, it's in the South, it's about a straight relationship. It's like in the 1940s. What does it have to do with my life? Who cares? Who hasn't felt love? I mean, it's done so well. Who hasn't felt love, or hasn't been jaded, or who hasn't been unrequited love, and who doesn't love? It's Romeo and Juliet, right? So I think we're always looking for what are the details of our lives, because we have to tell the details that are representative of a real deep core emotion that is connected with the reader in ways that are still a little mystical, but in ways that connect with people. The Gulf Motel. Who cares about the Gulf Motel? I'm sure you thought about your own place. I mean, the Gulf Motel was a catalyst for you to feel something, the same emotion that I felt, right, or similar. And so, the occasional. Don't get me wrong. It was. I had 3 weeks to write 3 poems, by the way. Which I'd never written. And so don't get me wrong, I'm making it sound easier than it is, but it has gotten easier. But that first round, I was like, oh boy. I was like, we're never prepared for that. But that's what I've discovered along the way. It's, in a way, no different than writing another poem. You just think of audience a little bit differently, but yeah, hope that helps. It's been fascinating, actually. It really has. All right.
Richard, thank you so much for being here this evening.
Sure.
I hope that you'll all join us for the book signing out in the concourse, where you'll have an opportunity to say hello to Richard and ask any additional questions. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.